So you've heard me talk about Katie Stevenson before, but for those of you that are new here and haven't heard me talk about Miss Katie, she's one of our heroes from Embry Hills. We first met her back in 2001, and she had just moved to Atlanta from East Orange, New Jersey before we did, before we arrived in Atlanta. She had worked as a nurse in New Jersey, and she had thrown out her back at some point in her career, and she had back trouble. Still to this day has severe pain in her back. She's had several other tragedies in her life. She's lost children. One child she lost to cancer. You heard me tell the story about when she was carrying triplets, and she had 5 children at the time. And her husband had left her, and she was there by herself with all those kids. And as she's leading, the house catches on fire, and as she's leading all those kids out of the house because of the smoke inhalation, she goes into preterm labor, and she was bearing triplets, and she was going to name the girls Faith, Hope, and Love, but only Hope survived. And the remarkable thing about Miss Katie, if you're around her very much, is just this joy that she has continually. Her life verse is, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." And her motto, which she is very well known for, is, "The devil's not going to steal my joy." No matter what happens in her life, no matter how bad things get, she just has this indomitable faith that perseveres, and this joy that exudes in everything that she is about. We used to have a Bible study at her house every Friday afternoon at her apartment. And she would routinely have neighbors to come. And you know the reason why they were there is they wanted to have the faith that Miss Katie had. And just think so much about her. But suffering and persecution are a part of the life of the child of God. It's something that we're not supposed to be surprised about, for those of you who are in the 1 Peter class. It's something that we were to expect, is that not only is there going to be suffering in this world that's cursed by sin, but there's going to be aggressive attempts to sway us from our faith. And that's what we're going to be looking at this morning as we finish out our series. I know we're only halfway through the book of Daniel, but the last 6 chapters don't preach quite like the first 6 chapters of Daniel. But we're going to finish out our series in the book of Daniel looking at perhaps the most iconic of all the chapters in the book of Daniel, as Daniel faced the lion's den. And we're going to talk about how we can use Daniel's example as a template to follow. How do we prepare ourselves for the lions? How do we prepare ourselves not only for suffering, but for persecution? And persecution is very much as real today as it ever has been. And we need to be doing the things that Daniel was doing, because what we're going to find out about Daniel is that when he did find himself facing the lions, he didn't change anything. He just kept doing what he always did. And so we need to be patterning our lives after his life, so that when that day comes for us, we just keep doing what we've always done. And so let's read together, as we've done with each one of these lessons. Let's read together the chapter, and then we'll make some applications. Daniel chapter 6. By the way, we are in a different kingdom at this point. We're no longer with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. We're now in the Persian Empire and Darius. Chapter 6 and verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the documents that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then, at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. We could have the invitation song right now and go home and say it has been good to be here. This chapter, it preaches itself. I don't have to do much. In fact, I don't have to do anything to improve upon what this chapter just spoke to us. But I hope to bring out some points that I hope will be helpful to us as we think about ways that we can prepare ourselves now to face the lions when they come. 3 things that we see Daniel did. First of all, Daniel maintained a consistent conduct before God. Daniel had a lot of enemies in the kingdom, and you understand why. Daniel was successful, and with success breeds envy. Why was Jesus handed over by the chief priest to Pilate? Even Pilate recognized that their motive was envy. And Daniel is being treated in the same way. He is being groomed to be put over all the satraps, all the officials in the kingdom, and that just drives his enemies nuts. They cannot stand the fact that Daniel is successful. And so they're looking for anything. You can imagine them going down to the deepest, darkest cellars, pulling up anything that Daniel has signed, any document that he put his signature on. Surely we can find something against Daniel, because we've got to bring him down. Understand that when you do the right thing, people are not going to like you necessarily. Some people are. Your boss is likely going to appreciate you very much. He, like Darius, is going to see you as being very valuable to your company. He's going to see you as very valuable to whatever organization you're in. But not everyone's going to see you that way. And as my father told me when I took my first job at Western Supermarket, he said, David, the cream will always rise to the top. You just do the right thing. You put your head down. My grandfather told me when I took that job, he said, when you've done everything that you're supposed to do and you don't have anything to do, go find a broom. Start sweeping. Stay busy. Don't wait for the boss to come and tell you what to do. And I imagine that that's the kind of man that Daniel was. That's the way he distinguished himself. When he was given a job to do, he did it. He did it with all his might. He did exactly what he was told. And he did it with integrity. Didn't matter if anybody was watching over his shoulder. Didn't matter if anybody knew what he was doing in the secret or not. He always acted with character. He acted honestly. He acted with integrity. So they couldn't find anything about him. It's kind of the same way that I see Joseph. When Joseph was sold off into slavery, into Egypt, and he ends up in Potiphar's house, what happens? Everything that he does is blessed. Why do you think it was blessed? Well, we know why he was blessed. He was blessed because the Lord was with him. Why was the Lord with Joseph? It's because Joseph was fearing God. He always did what he was supposed to do. Not because Potiphar deserved his obedience any more than Nebuchadnezzar or Darius deserved Daniel's submission. He did it because it was right before God. And what happens when you have someone like that is you're going to be exalted. Not always. But generally speaking, the cream will rise to the top, and that will bring enemies. I want to encourage you. The best way to prepare for the lions, and the lions are going to come. You're going to have enemies in your life who are going to be looking over your shoulder, who are going to be looking for any kind of dirt they can find on you. Just do the right thing. Always. Always do the right thing. Act with integrity. Always tell the truth. As Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. The nice thing I heard someone say about telling the truth, you don't have to remember what you said. Just always tell the truth. Always let your yes be yes, your no be no. You don't have to remember the story. Be a man of your word. Be a woman of your word. Keep your promises. Follow through on things. When you say you're going to do it, do it. Act with integrity. And do your best work all the time, even when nobody else is looking. Because, believe it or not, someone is watching. Even when you think nobody else knows what you're doing, someone is watching. And this points to character. Integrity, they say, is what you are or who you are when no one's watching. On the job, we understand that we're to serve our earthly masters or bosses as we would Christ. Colossians chapter 3, Ephesians chapter 6. We're not working for the boss. We're working for the Lord. And so the lions are going to come. But if you always tell the truth, if you always do your best work, you never have to be looking over your shoulder. And you can go to bed at night in peace, at rest, knowing you're pleasing the Lord. And so keep a consistent conduct before God. Or as Peter puts it, and I do believe Peter was thinking about Daniel when he wrote this, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that not if, but when they speak against you as evildoers. This is going to come. When they speak against you as evildoers, they may see what? Your good deeds, because that's all there is to see. They may see your good deeds and then glorify God on the day of visitation. Yes, that's what we see in this chapter, is a Gentile king Just like we saw in chapter 4, just like we saw in chapter 3, chapter 2, a Gentile king glorifying God because of the faithful conduct of Daniel. So the first thing Daniel did is he kept a consistent character before God. The second thing we see he did is he kept a consistent prayer life before God. Chapter 6 and verse 10 is so powerful. You realize that Daniel could have done a lot of things when he found out that this injunction was signed. This is not just some ordinary person in the kingdom. This is Daniel. Daniel has clout in the kingdom. He has political power. Now, I don't know if he actually could have affected any kind of change, but he could have raised the stink. He could have made it known to everyone what an injustice this was, how unjust or how illegal this law was. But Daniel doesn't go on a protest. He doesn't go out there marching in the streets, talking about how evil and how wicked this government was. You could say that what he did was a protest, but even that, I think, might be too strong of a word. If it was a protest, it was a silent protest. Actually, all Daniel did when he found out this injunction was signed is he did the same thing he had always done. He prayed 3 times a day. 3 times a day. As he had been doing, we would have to assume, for years. This is not a young Daniel. When you read Daniel chapter 6, don't think about the little boy that we were introduced to back in chapter 1. It's been 70 years. We don't know how old Daniel was when he was taken off into captivity. He could have been a preteen, early teen, but he's not that anymore. This is an old man, and he's been doing this, we've got to believe, for a long time. What did Daniel do when he found out this injunction had been signed? He didn't do anything different. He just did what he always did, praying 3 times a day. And I love the fact that it says he not only prayed 3 times a day, but he gave thanks. What's he giving thanks for? You could say, arguably, that this is one of the worst days, potentially, of his life. He's about to lose his life because he's praying to God. What is he giving thanks for? Let me tell you another story about Miss Katie. One day I got a call from Miss Katie that one of her daughters back in New Jersey had just been killed. A gang-related incident. They believed that it was an initiation. She didn't know the people who killed her. This was just a random act of violence. What do you say to a mother who just got that call? I remember driving to her apartment thinking, what in the world can I say at this moment that will help her deal with this tragedy? And honestly, I don't remember what I said. But I remember what she said. As tears were streaming down her cheeks, she said, as she always did, I'm not going to let the devil steal my joy. That's what she said. And I remember calling James Newman as soon as I left her apartment and saying, brother, I went to encourage her, and I was the one who was encouraged. I couldn't believe what I just heard. Those were not just words. Where does that kind of faith come? Where does that kind of joy come? It doesn't come just because you decide in the moment that that's the way you're going to live. This was her pattern of life. Daniel gave thanks on this day because he always gave thanks. This wasn't something new. This wasn't a coping mechanism. This wasn't his way of trying to figure out how he's going to deal with death. This is what he always did. And the reason why he was able to face those lions is because he had established this as a part of his life. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17 can be read in a couple of different ways. One way to read it is just always be praying throughout the day. If you're not locked into a specific prayer, be in a thought process of praying throughout throughout the day. Pray without ceasing. That's one way that you could read that, and maybe that's what Paul meant. But another way to read this, which I kind of prefer, and it goes along with the lesson this morning, is don't give up on prayer. When life gets tough, when life is hard, keep praying. And when life is good, and you may not feel the need to pray, and you may not feel the need to draw on God's help, pray. I remember being in a Bible study for preachers several years back. I was a very young preacher at the time, and the subject for the week was the Psalms. And at the end of each lesson, there would be a Q&A after where we could ask the presenter different lessons on the psalm that he had just covered. And I remember in this one session, there were several guys that mentioned specific times in their life where they learned how to pray. And they learned how to pray when they went through some really traumatic event in their life. And I remember at the time feeling as a young man, I don't feel very good about my prayer life. And I remember going to Alan Yater in between the sessions. And I said, Alan, am I going to have to wait till Adrian gets cancer to learn how to pray? Am I going to have to wait until some tragedy strikes one of my kids before I learn how to pray? I remember Alan being a very emotional guy, and I was asking him this because I know Alan's a very prayerful man. Alan's eyes filling up with tears, and he said, David, don't wait until tragedy strikes to learn how to pray. Learn how to pray now so that when that happens, you don't lose your faith. Look, the lines are going to come. Suffering is going to happen. Persecution is going to happen. Don't be surprised, chapter 4 of 1 Peter, when this fiery trial tries you, as some strange thing is happening to you. This is not abnormal. This is the normal. This is the typical. This is the expected. So don't try to figure out how to start talking to God when that happens. Daniel didn't have to do anything different. He kept doing what he had always done. Pray without ceasing. Ephesians 5 and verse 20, we're approaching this month of the year where we think more about giving thanks. Paul says don't make this a one-day-a-year thing. Giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I don't believe he's speaking by exaggeration. He's saying even when the worst day comes, give thanks. Give thanks always. And even when the worst possible situation arises in your life, find something in that situation. Give thanks in everything. Daniel was giving thanks. We don't know what the content of his thanksgiving was, but we know what was going on in his life. And he gave thanks on that day because that's what he had always done. So Daniel was able to face the lions because he maintained a consistent conduct before God, a consistent prayer life in God, but finally, he had a consistent faith in God. It's very obvious from this chapter that the king, just like Nebuchadnezzar before him, cared about Daniel. The king didn't know what to do. In fact, I think that's kind of the author's way, the historian's way of poking fun at the laws of the Medes and Persians. We keep being reminded that they can't change these laws. And you understand why in ancient times they couldn't change the laws. It's because they believed that these kings were either divine or semi-divine. They don't make mistakes. And if you don't make mistakes, you should never have to change your laws. A whole lesson there we could talk about. But the king can't sleep. The king goes to bed all worried and anxious about this Daniel that he cared about so much. But what he says here may be one of the main points in the whole chapter. The king declared to Daniel, after he had exhausted, he had thought all day long, how can I save Daniel? Couldn't think of anything. What does he say? May your God, he doesn't call upon his God, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Two interesting things here about this. Number one, he knows that Daniel serves his God. He knows who's Daniel's God is. And not only does the king know that, the enemies of Daniel know that. That's the reason why they made this law. They knew what Daniel's faith was. They knew what his character was. But the second thing is he's calling on Daniel's God. I wonder if he knows the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know. I wonder. But I wonder if he knows that story. You know what? When all else failed, we know who saved them. May your God, whom you serve continually, now save you from the mistake that I have made. You can't read this chapter, though, in chapter 6 without thinking about chapter 1. Daniel had always had this kind of faith in God. Before he even went, I don't believe that he made the decision in Daniel 1 and verse 8, oh, wait a minute, guys, we really shouldn't be eating this food or drinking this wine. I believe this was a decision they made long before this opportunity or this situation ever presented itself. He had resolved that he would not defile himself, and he was willing to suffer. He was willing to step up and say, we can't do this. And I know that makes your position as the eunuch really uncomfortable, and it makes our position standing out from everyone else really uncomfortable. But he was willing to go through that uncomfortable situation and suffer that persecution so that he might not defile himself. You've got to believe that after a lifetime of making choices like this, don't think that Daniel 1 and Daniel 6 are the only times that Daniel's faith was ever tested. These are just the two examples we have. But after a lifetime of facing those kind of decisions, facing those kind of tough choices, now in chapter 6, he doesn't have to think twice. He knows what he's going to do. He's going to serve God, and he does that. That's why we've got to train and prepare ourselves. I want to look at a few verses. They're not on the screen. I want to look at a few verses with you over in 1 Peter. I know y'all are studying, many of you, in the auditorium with Ashley, 1 Peter. But I want to look, there's a lot of statements in 1 Peter about suffering, as I know you've talked about. But he talks in chapter 1 about the fiery trial let me read this. Verse 6, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So he talks about this faith that goes through the fire. What is the persecution that Peter has on his mind? Well, one of the things that he's thinking about in this book, look over at chapter 2, is people speaking against you. We looked at this verse earlier. Verse 11, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. That's part of the fire, is when people speak against you as evildoers. Chapter 3 and verse 14. Let me start back in verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering, that you also may rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Again, notice it's what people say about you, and that's chapter 4, not chapter 3. I'm sorry about that. But chapter 4 and verse 14, same thing. What kind of suffering is Peter imagining? When you were insulted. Insulted why? For the name of Christ, because of who you are, because of what you believe. That is suffering for righteousness' sake. What I meant to read in chapter 3, I turned 2 pages. In verse 14, chapter 3 and verse 14, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are what? When you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. That is now 3 verses that connect suffering or identify suffering as when people speak against you for the name of Christ. Are you doing the right thing? Then look at one more verse from chapter 4. Verse 1, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised that when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they do what? They malign you. They make fun of you. Whoever said, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, doesn't know what he's talking about. Biblically speaking, that's not true. Biblically speaking, according to 1 Peter, no less than 4 times, persecution are the things that people say about you. And let me tell you, that is how you prepare for the lion's den. No, I don't know of anyone in this audience. Now, I know of people in different places of the world where they have been beaten, where they have gone to jail because of their faith in Jesus Christ. I know of a man who was poisoned because of his faith in Christ. But I don't know of anyone here. We live in a land where there is freedom, and we have the freedom of worship, the freedom of speech. We should give thanks to God for these freedoms. But these freedoms are not guaranteed. These freedoms can, and at some point, will be taken from us. Because you know what's going to happen in the United States of America? Same thing that happened to Babylon, same thing that happened to Persia, Greeks, Rome, every other world empire that's ever been. And Jeremiah 12 and verse 5 asks this question that you and I need to think about. If you have raced with men on foot and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? You have a hard time keeping up with these men? How are you going to deal with the horses? What's he say? If in a safe land you are so trusting, what will you do in the thickets of the Jordan? Now, I'm not saying that it's easy to be a Christian now. Suffering is real, even in this free land where we live. There are still people who make fun of you. There are still people who will malign you. There are still people who will look for accusations against you because you're doing the right thing and because you're successful, because the Lord has blessed you. You're going to face that. But understand that this may be our Daniel chapter 1. What we're going through right now in this country right now may be our Daniel chapter 1, preparing us for the Daniel chapter 6. And so what should we do? Well, 2 things. Number 1, as Peter told us, we should rejoice. Moms and dads, when your child comes home from school and they've been made fun of because they did the right thing, because they're trying to be a godly young man or young woman or a Christian, do not go haywire and lose all control and all perspective in that moment. Rejoice. I'm not saying you don't sympathize with your child. I'm not saying you say, hey, that was not fair and they shouldn't have said that about you. I'm saying make sure you communicate to your children that this is a blessing. That's what Peter tells us. This is a blessing that you should go through this. That, more than anything else, will prepare them for Daniel chapter 6. And when the same thing happens to us, we should do that. But here's the second application. And this is the end of the lesson. Where is our citizenship? Were Daniel's hopes and dreams riding on that promotion? Is that what his life was all about? I've worked so hard, 70 years, I've always done the right thing. And here these people are maligning me. They're making up laws that'll put me into this lion's den. This is not right. Was that Daniel's perspective? Or did Daniel have a different perspective? A perspective that was shaped by what he did 3 times a day. 3 times a day. And where were his windows open? Toward Jerusalem. And why were they open there? Because that's where God was. That's where God had promised to hear his people. That's where his home was. And every time your child is persecuted for the name of Christ, that's just another way of reinforcing this lesson that we all need to learn, that this world is not our home. This is not what it's all about. If you don't get that promotion, if you don't get that award at school, if you don't get that job, whatever it is, it's okay, because that's not what our life is all about. Our citizenship is in heaven. Let's never forget that. And let's see persecution as a means, as an opportunity of God reminding us who we are and what our life is all about. And rejoicing because we're able to suffer for the name of Christ. How does that sound like as an invitation? Are you ready? Are you ready to become a Christian? Knowing that this is what you're signing up for? Knowing that this very likely could lead to your physical death if our freedom should be taken away? Are you ready to sign up for that? It's interesting. I can't prove this, but it's interesting that Daniel is sealed up in this, what sounds like a cave, a lion's den, with this giant rock. And they seal it up. And then at break of day, what do we find? Daniel walking out of that lion's den, alive, because the Lord protected him. Does that sound like anything familiar to you? Does that sound like it? I can't prove it, but it kind of sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? That's the hope that we have. That even if we should suffer and even die for righteousness' sake, there is something that the world cannot take away from us, because Jesus walked out of that grave. And we can walk out someday out of our graves because he's coming again. That's what you're signing up for. Are you ready to become a Christian? Are you ready to repent of your sins, confess your faith in Jesus Christ, be baptized, so that you can be raised out of the grave to walk in newness of life? Why don't you come as we stand and sing?